It was the most desperate act of conservation Japan had ever attempted, and it started with a single bird in a cage. In 1981, on the island of Sado in the Sea of Japan, wildlife biologists captured the last 5 wild crested ibis left on Earth. Not in Japan, on Earth. The species that had once filled the skies of East Asia by the millions had been reduced through decades of pesticide use, habitat destruction, and hunting, to 5 individuals clinging to existence on a single island. Scientists placed them in a breeding facility and watched. None of them reproduced. By 2003, the last Japanese-born crested ibis had died in captivity. What happened next, over 30 years, on an island that had forgotten how to feed a bird, would rewrite what scientists believed was possible in species recovery. To understand why Sado mattered, you have to understand what the crested ibis once was. Nipponia, Nippon, named for Japan itself, was not a rare bird. For centuries, it nested across China, Japan, Korea, and Russia in numbers so vast that farmers considered it a nuisance. It fed in the shallow rice paddies that blanketed East Asia's lowlands, probing the mud for loach, frogs, and crayfish with its long, curved, crimson-tipped bill. During breeding season, its white plumage flushed a deep salmon pink, a color produced not by pigment in the feathers themselves, but by a secretion from a gland near the neck that the birds applied by preening. Village children grew up watching flocks of pink-white birds lift from flooded fields at dawn, wheeling above the paddies in loose formations before descending to feed in the early light. Then the 20th century arrived. Japan's rapid industrialization brought organochlorine pesticides, DDT and BHC, directly into the paddies the ibis depended on. These chemicals did not kill the birds outright, they killed the food chain beneath them. Loach populations collapsed. Frog numbers plummeted. The aquatic invertebrates that supported the entire feeding ecology of the species disappeared from field after field, season after season. Eggshell thinning caused by chemical accumulation meant that even the few nesting attempts that occurred produced eggs that cracked under the weight of incubating parents. Hunting, widespread enough in the late 19th century to have collapsed populations across entire regions, had already done its damage. Forest clearing removed the tall, old-growth trees the ibis required for colonial nesting, species like Japanese cedar and zelkova that take generations to mature. By 1960, national surveys found fewer than 100 birds remaining across all of Japan. By 1970, fewer than 30. By 1981, 5. Sado Island, 855 square kilometers of mountain ridgeline and terraced rice paddies rising from the Sea of Japan in Niigata Prefecture, had held on longer than anywhere else. The island's geography had helped, with a rugged interior, limited road access compared to the mainland, and a farming culture that had been slower to adopt the full suite of industrial agricultural chemicals. But by the time those 5 birds were captured, the paddies of Sado were ecologically indistinguishable from anywhere else in Japan. The water ran clear, but the loach were gone. The frogs were gone. The invertebrates were gone. The island that had sheltered the last wild ibis was, for that species, a beautiful and empty shell. Japan turned to China. In 1981, the same year Japan's last wild birds were captured, Chinese ornithologist Liu Yinzheng completed a 3-year survey across the entire country, searching for surviving ibis. He found 7 in a remote valley in Shanxi province, called Yang County, living in a stand of old pine trees above flooded rice paddies that had been farmed the same way for generations. China had its own population, and China agreed to help. In 1999, 2 ibis, Yu and Yang, were sent to Japan as diplomatic gifts. beginning a cooperative breeding program between the two countries that would become the biological foundation of everything that followed. But the scientists working on Sado understood something clearly from the beginning. Breeding birds in captivity was the easy part. The hard part was making the island capable of sustaining them. Releasing Ibis into paddies with no prey was not conservation. It was theatre. The island had to be rebuilt first. What followed was one of the most intensive ecosystem reconstructions in Japanese history, conducted not by engineers with machinery, but by farmers with price incentives and centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to flood a paddy. By the 1980s, Sado's farmers had converted almost entirely to modern mechanized agriculture. Concrete irrigation channels replaced the earthen ditches that had once allowed water, sediment, and small animals to move freely across the landscape. Synthetic pesticide regimes kept yields high and predictable. The paddies looked identical to any productive rice field in Japan, but biologically they were nearly sterile. Loach, the crested ibis's most critical prey item, a small benthic fish that thrives in the muddy substrate of traditionally managed paddies, had essentially disappeared from the island. Niigata Prefecture and the national government launched a certification program called Toki no Kome, or Ibis rice. Farmers who agreed to eliminate synthetic pesticides entirely, restore earthen irrigation channels, and maintain traditional deep flooding paddy management received a guaranteed price premium of 30 to 50 yen per kilogram above standard market rates. For small-scale rice growers operating on thin margins, that premium was the difference between a viable farm and one that was not. Over 400 households on Sado enrolled in the program by the mid-2000s. Pesticide applications on participating farms fell by more than 80%. Some fields went to zero chemical inputs for the first time in decades. The biological response was rapid and measurable. Within 3 years of conversion, loach populations began recovering in enrolled paddies. Researchers from Niigata University conducting systematic aquatic surveys documented the return of dragonfly larvae, water beetles, and freshwater snails, species absent from monitored fields for more than 20 years. Frog densities climbed. The paddies that had been biological deserts were, patch by patch, coming back to life. The food was returning before the birds arrived to eat it. In parallel, the Sado Wildlife Conservation Center, the captive breeding facility housing the growing ibis population, began preparing birds for release using graduated wild conditioning protocols. Birds were moved into large outdoor enclosures that exposed them to weather, live prey, and natural light cycles. Foraging training sessions introduced captive-bred birds to live loach and frogs in controlled conditions, reducing the learning curve they would face in the wild. It wasn't perfect preparation. Nothing is for an animal that would normally learn from wild parents, but it was the best available approximation. On September the 25th, 2008, 10 crested ibis bred at the center were released into the wild on Sado. It was the first time the species had flown free in Japan since the 1970s. Each bird carried a colored leg band and a radio transmitter. A dedicated monitoring team tracked every signal, every location, every observed behavior. In the first weeks, the data was uneasy reading. Captive-bred birds probed concrete irrigation channels where no prey lived. Several roosted in locations that suggested disorientation. One bird struck a power line and died. The transmitters showed erratic movement patterns. Birds were covering large areas without settling into productive foraging zones. Then the signals began to stabilize. 8 more birds were released in 2009, bringing the total to 18. And through the second winter, the monitoring data started telling a different story. The surviving birds had begun to map Sado. They concentrated, not randomly, but with consistent fidelity, in the pesticide-free paddies enrolled in the Ibis rice program. Field observers recording foraging behavior documented successful prey capture rates, averaging once every 4 to 6 minutes in converted traditional paddies. In chemically managed fields nearby, the same birds captured almost nothing. The loach the farmers had allowed to return were feeding the ibis. The two halves of the recovery, the agricultural and the biological, were connecting. In 2012, the monitoring team confirmed what they had been waiting a decade to hear. A wild pair had built a nest. The eggs were fertile. They hatched. 2 chicks fledged and survived to independence. Dr. Kiyoaki Ozaki of the National Institute for Environmental Studies, who had been involved in Sado's Ibis program for years, said publicly that hearing the confirmation was something he had trained himself to stop anticipating. The professional discipline of conservation biology requires a kind of managed hope, with expectations held low enough to survive repeated failure. The 2012 nesting broke through that discipline. The population grew slowly at first, constrained by the cautious pace of wild reproduction. Annual releases from the breeding center continued, adding numbers and genetic diversity. Then the wild hatched cohort began to matter. These were birds that had learned Sado from their parents, birds that knew which paddies held the highest loach densities in late autumn, which trees offered the most stable nesting platforms, and which flight corridors connected foraging grounds to roost sites on the mountain slopes. Wild hatch birds were measurably more effective foragers than captive bred releases. Each generation improved. The recovery began to accelerate from within. By 2020, the wild crested ibis population on Sado had reached 480 individuals. By 2023, surveys confirmed more than 600 birds living wild on the island, a figure so far beyond what anyone had projected in the early years of the program that the comparison to the 1981 baseline of 5 barely registers as the same story. But Sado produced an outcome beyond the biological one. The recovery became economically self-reinforcing in ways the program's designers had hoped for but could not guarantee. Toki no Kome, Ibis rice, became one of the most recognized premium rice brands in Japan. Restaurants in Tokyo and Osaka pay significant markups for Sado rice certified under the Ibis conservation standards. Not because the rice tastes different, though some argue the traditional management does affect grain quality, but because it carries a story that Japanese consumers are willing to pay for. Tourism to Sado doubled between 2012 and 2019, driven largely by the wild nesting confirmations and the ibis observation programs that developed around them. Farmers reported that beyond the certification premium, the return of functioning paddy ecology had reduced their costs in other ways. Natural pest control returned with the frogs, soil biology improved without chemical disruption, and water management became more stable. The ecological and the economic collapsed into the same system. More ibis required more traditional paddies. More traditional paddies produced more certified rice. More certified rice generated more farmer income. More farmer income funded more conversion. Conservation became agriculture, and agriculture became conservation, and neither was extracting from the other. In 2024, Japan and China announced the expansion of the program. A second wild population will be established in the Yangtze River Basin in China, drawing from a combined captive and wild gene pool that now numbers 10,000 individuals, built from those 7 birds Liu Yinzheng found in a Shaanxi valley in 1981. What happened on Sado was not the story of 18 birds, released into a landscape, and left to recover. It was the story of 400 farming families who stopped poisoning the water. It was the story of foresters who identified the right trees and protected them. It was the story of loach returning to paddies that had been empty for 30 years, frogs returning after them, and ibis landing in fields that were finally, again, worth landing in. The island did not receive the birds. It rebuilt itself into a place that birds could live. Paddy by paddy, tree by tree, season by season, across 3 decades of deliberate and unglamorous work by people whose names do not appear in the headlines. 18 birds, 30 years, 600 wild animals on an island that had none. The island had forgotten the species, and then, slowly, it remembered.